On the sunny afternoon of June 25th, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry surveyed one of the largest Native American encampments in history from the bluffs across the Little Bighorn River. Custer and his troops had marched nearly 100 miles in pursuit of Sitting Bull, the camp's leader, with the aim of compelling Sitting Bull and his allied Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes to return to the Great Sioux Reservation. However, Sitting Bull had not consented to any treaty and was determined to maintain his people's nomadic way of life, thus preparing to resist the Americans to protect it. Custer split his 7th Cavalry into 4 divisions, 3 companies led by Captain Frederick Benteen, 3 additional companies under Major Marcus A. Reno, 5 companies commanded by Custer himself, and the rest accompanying the supply train. This confrontation, emblematic of the rising power of the United States against the last strongholds of the Plains Indians, would significantly influence the trajectory of the American West for generations. On April 29, 1868, the United States and certain factions of the Sioux Nation ratified the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, which delineated the boundaries of the Great Sioux Reservation. The treaty mandated that the Native Americans refrain from attacking American railroads or settlers, and instead depend on government assistance for their livelihood. The U.S. government, intent on extending its reach westward, sought to encourage the Native Americans to adopt a more American way of life and settle permanently in reservations. Nevertheless, some Sioux tribes did not endorse this treaty and therefore felt no obligation to adhere to its stipulations. The leader of these non-signatory Indians, Sitting Bull, rejected the treaty and was vehemently against residing on a reservation. In 1874, the U.S. Army dispatched George Custer on an expedition into the Black Hills to identify a suitable location for an American fort and to investigate reports of gold in the region. A modest quantity of gold was uncovered, resulting in a surge of American settlers in the area. This expedition was a clear breach of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, escalating tensions with the Sioux. In 1875, the United States government mandated that all non-reservation Indians return to their designated reservations by January 31, 1876, or face military intervention. By the deadline, the non-treaty Indians had not complied, prompting preparations for conflict. Throughout the spring of 1876, the U.S. Army formulated a strategy to compel the non-treaty Indians to relocate to the Great Sioux Reservation. This strategy involved General George Crook advancing from Fort Fetterman in Wyoming with 1,000 troops, Colonel John Gibbon moving east from Fort Ellis along the Yellowstone River with 450 soldiers, and General Alfred Terry marching west from Fort Lincoln in Dakota Territory with 879 men, primarily from the 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's command. It was anticipated that any of these 3 forces could easily confront Sitting Bull and his estimated 800 to 1,500 warriors if they encountered them. Moreover, it was believed that if one of these groups discovered the camp without the others, they would still engage, as the Indians were significantly more mobile and their movement patterns were highly unpredictable. On June 4th, a Sundance ceremony took place at Deer Medicine Rocks, during which Sitting Bull envisioned United States soldiers invading his camp, foretelling a significant victory over the Bluecoats. On June 10th, Major Marcus A. Reno and 6 companies of the 7th Cavalry were assigned to a 10-day reconnaissance mission between the Powder River and Tongue River to locate Sitting Bull's camp. On June 17th, Crook's column was ambushed around 10 a.m. by Lakota and Cheyenne forces led by Crazy Horse along the Rosebud River. The Battle of the Rosebud culminated in a minor victory for the Lakota, compelling General Crook to withdraw and await reinforcements. On the same day, Major Reno returned from his reconnaissance mission and informed General Terry of his findings regarding deserted Lakota villages in the valley. Consequently, on June 22nd, Custer was assigned 12 companies of the 7th Cavalry with instructions to advance up the Rosebud Creek in pursuit of Crazy Horse. Custer and his forces were anticipated to assault the Indian camp, prompting the Indians to retreat toward the now united forces of Terry and Gibbon, thereby encircling the Lakota and compelling their surrender. On the morning of June 25th, Custer's scouts finally located the village, estimating its population at approximately 8,000, with a combat-ready force of between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors. Although Custer initially intended to launch a surprise attack on the morning of the 26th, his scouts informed him that the Lakota had become aware of his presence. In light of this intelligence, Custer resolved to initiate an immediate attack, fearing that the Lakota might evade any American forces and remain outside the reservation. The Indian camp was situated on a flat plain at the heart of the Little Bighorn River, with steep, uneven bluffs on the eastern bank. The Americans executed a two-pronged assault, with Major Marcus A. Reno attacking the southern portion of the Indian camp, while Custer maneuvered along the bluffs to assault the northern flank. Captain Frederick Benteen was positioned in reserve to provide support to either segment of the attack. Major Reno crossed the Little Bighorn around 3 p.m. and charged towards the village, unaware of its size or strength due to the obstructing trees at a bend in the river. Upon passing this bend, Reno comprehended the vastness of the village and suspected he had fallen into a trap. Reno advanced and commanded his troops to dismount and establish a skirmish line, opening fire on the village, which resulted in indiscriminate casualties among both civilians and soldiers. After 20 minutes of gunfire, Reno had suffered only one casualty, but an Indian force had gathered in a sheltered area and launched an assault primarily targeting the left flank of Reno's line, compelling his detachment to retreat to a wooded bend along the Little Bighorn River. Despite this, the Indian onslaught persisted, and Reno's scout, Bloody Knife, was fatally shot, with his blood splattering onto Reno. This understandably left Reno profoundly unsettled, prompting him to order his men to mount, dismount, and mount again. He then instructed those wishing to escape to follow him, leading a chaotic retreat across the river, which tragically left his wounded behind. During this withdrawal, many soldiers were struck down as they crossed the river under fire from the Indians. Reno and the remaining troops scrambled up the 8-foot-high bluffs to reach a defensible position. Shortly thereafter, Benteen arrived to join Reno and his now severely rattled men. Benteen had been on a reconnaissance mission when he received a message from Custer, urging him to hurry to a large village and to bring supplies. Although Benteen was uncertain of the message's implications, he deduced that Custer was engaged in combat. Nevertheless, Reno refused to mobilize his forces until the supplies arrived, as the baggage train was trailing behind Benteen. As the superior officer in the area, Reno had the authority to override Benteen, who was eager to assist Custer as swiftly as possible. Meanwhile, the Indians who had been engaged with the remnants of Reno's forces shifted downstream towards Custer's unit. It was around this time that gunfire from downstream was heard by the soldiers on Reno Hill, indicating that Custer had encountered hostilities somewhere further down the river. Reno was uncertain about the location of the defense on the hill, so he chose to descend the bluff in search of the body of one of his subordinates. Meanwhile, Benteen was organizing a defense on the hill. Captain Thomas Weir, feeling disheartened by the lack of urgency displayed by his superiors, disobeyed orders and led his D Company onto the bluffs to assist Custer. This action motivated other soldiers on the hill, including Benteen, to follow Weir. Upon reaching the northern point of the bluffs, Captain Weir observed a smoky battle approximately 4 miles away, where warriors were seen firing at targets on the ground. At this moment, the Americans believed that Custer had been overwhelmed by the Indians. After concluding their northern engagement, the Indians began skirmishing with Weir and Benteen along the bluff. Benteen decided to withdraw his extended forces and successfully returned to Reno Hill, suffering only one casualty. The defenders on Reno Hill managed to hold their position against Indian fire until sunset. The following day, the Indians attempted to exploit their advantage from the southern end of the hill. However, with the high ground and a force of 300 men, Reno and Benteen effectively defended the hill, incurring minimal casualties. After an unsuccessful assault on Reno Hill, the Indian camp retreated further down the valley, signaling the conclusion of the Battle of Little Bighorn. The fate of Custer's detachment remains largely speculative, as much of the information is derived from second-hand accounts and continues to be a subject of debate. During Reno's engagement, Custer was advancing up the bluffs along the northern side of the Little Bighorn River. He witnessed Reno successfully holding off the Indians during the initial phase of the battle and proceeded northward in an effort to capture non-combatants, which he intended to use as leverage against the Indians. Subsequently, Custer dispatched 3 companies under Captain Miles Keogh to Loose Ridge to serve as a marker for the arriving troops of Benteen. Custer, accompanied by Captain George Yates, advanced down Medicine Tail Coulee towards the Little Bighorn River. Upon arrival, Custer observed that the village was entirely abandoned, save for a few Indian warriors. Company L, led by James Calhoun, engaged the Indian warriors stationed near the riverbank. Consequently, Custer opted against crossing the river, choosing instead to regroup with Captain Coe and proceed north to apprehend non-combatants. Custer instructed Captain Coe to remain stationed atop Calhoun Hill, while he and Captain Yates, along with their troops, sought a suitable location to cross the river and capture the non-combatants. As Custer advanced towards the Little Bighorn, the group that had engaged Reno crossed the river and approached the troops positioned on Calhoun Hill. Custer, observing thousands of non-combatants fleeing the village, realized that the sheer number was too great for his limited forces to capture, prompting him to move his troops to Cemetery Ridge and await Benteen's arrival. Once Benteen arrived, Custer would have sufficient manpower to seize the majority of the non-combatants. However, as numerous Indian warriors advanced through Calhoun Coulee, Coe dispatched Company C from the reserve into Calhoun Coulee to protect his right flank. Unfortunately, Company C's position compromised the range of Coe's forces. The Indians then launched a counter-offensive against Company C's skirmish line, intensifying their assault. Lacking support from Captain Coe's troops, Company C was compelled to retreat on foot to Calhoun Ridge, suffering significant losses as the attack decimated over half of their ranks. In response, James Calhoun attempted to reposition his skirmish line westward to assist the remaining members of Company C. However, this new formation failed to guard against the Indian forces to the south, who advanced and opened fire on the skirmish line. Simultaneously, the Indians from the west pressed forward, leading to the collapse of the American line. The American forces were unable to reorganize their line. Company E, stationed on Cemetery Ridge, faced an assault from a contingent of Cheyenne warriors, which effectively severed their skirmish line. At this juncture, Captain Coe and his remaining troops found themselves encircled on three sides. Prominent warriors, including Crazy Horse, descended upon the remaining American forces, creating a state of disarray. The few surviving American soldiers attempted to escape across Battle Ridge, but were persistently diminished. Custer, observing the unfolding situation across Battle Ridge, repositioned his men to Last Stand Hill. Custer arranged his troops into two lines. As the remnants of Coe's men endeavored to reach Last Stand Hill, they were entirely decimated. The Indian warriors now encircled Custer and his forces, and with minimal cover available on the hill, Custer resorted to shooting his horses for protection. Utilizing the remaining horses, Custer dispatched riders from the hill in an attempt to disperse the gathering Indian warriors, who would subsequently return. However, these riders were intercepted and killed. At this point, Custer and his men found themselves utterly isolated atop Last Stand Hill. With no escape route, they were first diminished by gunfire and arrows, and then overwhelmed by the Indians armed with axes and clubs. By 5:50 p.m., the battle had concluded entirely. In total, Custer's detachment suffered the loss of all 210 men, while the entire American contingent at the Battle of the Little Bighorn incurred a total of 268 casualties. Unexpectedly, the Native Americans suffered a loss of around 50 warriors, resulting in a surprisingly unforeseen defeat for the American forces. By the conclusion of June 26th, Major Reno's remaining troops were oblivious to the fate that had befallen Custer. On June 27th, the united forces of Terry and Gibbon reached the battlefield, where they briefed Reno's men on Custer's demise. The surviving soldiers were genuinely astonished by Custer's defeat, as they had never entertained the notion that they could be vanquished by an indigenous force. While Sitting Bull and his warriors delivered a shocking blow to the Americans, the victory came at a significant cost. Custer's death became a unifying symbol for the opposition against the Native Americans. And within a year, most of the warriors involved in the Battle of the Little Bighorn had surrendered and were relocated to reservations. Sitting Bull ultimately fled to Canada, where he lived in exile for several years. Crazy Horse surrendered on May 6, 1877, and was placed in confinement at Pine Ridge Reservation. Following rumors of Crazy Horse's escape attempt from the reservation, American soldiers sought to apprehend him, leading to a confrontation in which he was fatally stabbed. Native American resistance persisted against American forces until the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890.